Welcome to In His Grip with Dr. Chuck F. Betters of markinc.org. Visit markinc.org, where you'll discover many free resources, videos, devotionals, and more that will equip you to walk by faith and offer help and hope. You can also find out about our online biblical counseling service. That's markinc.org.
Men and women then in Solomon's day, as now in our day, always test the boundaries of morality. We walk up to the line to see how big that line is. We widen that line with each generation. And we move closer and closer and closer until finally and ultimately we step over and not even realize how we have been like frogs in the kettle boiled. Even Solomon, the writer of the Proverbs, even Solomon could not follow his own advice. Even Solomon, as the Kings tell us, loved many strange women. And after that verse in Kings, 1 Kings, I believe it's chapter 13, after that verse where it says, and Solomon loved many strange women, the rest of the chapter and the rest of the following chapters paint for us this picture of the wisest man who ever lived morally falling into bankruptcy. And it all began when he loved many strange women. There is a slippery slope of moral failure. And I want to say to you up front, so that we can lay this foundation, I hope in a practical way, that moral failure begins with three youthful emotions that are never mastered. Kids are emotional. You're emotional. I'm emotional. We all live with some degree of emotion. But there are three youthful emotions that are pent up in just about every child, that if these emotions are not mastered, the probability of moral failure increases with each one of these specific emotions that the writer Solomon paints for us and shows us in these 9 chapters. Let me give you the first one. The first emotion in your children that needs to be mastered is fear. Now, I've been talking about the fear of God, and I hope I've given you a proper definition of the fear of God, but there's a different kind of fear. What starts out as the fear of monsters in the closet evolves into the fear of acceptance by their peers. Or maybe it's fear of failure. Or eventually it becomes fear of intimacy, fear of commitment. When you see a man who is angry, and he's demonstrating anger, the reason in most men you see that anger being spewed out is because of a root problem with fear. Many men who grow up angry are little boys who are still afraid. And they've never mastered the emotion of fear. Fear in women usually expresses itself in some form of control or manipulation. When you see women controlling their environment or manipulating their circumstances, guarding and making sure that everything properly fits around them, it's usually the result of fear that's never been mastered in childhood. Fear is something we never really grow out of. We either learn to control fear or we learn to cave into fear. Look at Proverbs chapter 3, verse 24. I hope you have that passage now. The father instructs his young child, when you lie down, verse 24, when you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Have no fear of sudden disaster or of the ruin that overtakes the wicked. For the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being snared. Have a holy boldness, a holy confidence that you are being held firmly in the grip of God's grace. You're in his grip. He's holding on to you when the monsters climb out of the closet. He's holding on to you when fear overwhelms you. He gives his beloved rest. You see, fear can be a life-dominating emotion. If it's not mastered, it lays a shaky foundation for many choices one is going to make with their lives. And we must teach our kids that God is our refuge and God is our strength while we sleep, while we're awake, when we're walking, when we're running, and yes, even when we're hiding. God is our refuge and God is our strength. No matter how frightening life becomes, no matter how many choices, fearful choices your kids will be faced with, no matter how many decisions, frightful decisions they have to make, if you teach them early that God gives his beloved rest, that when they sleep and when they're awake, he is holding them firmly in the grip of his grace. Even when it seems like he's not there, he's there. Even when he seems like he's distant, he's holding on. Even when he seems like he has abandoned you, he will never leave you and he will never forsake you. Now, you need to treat their fears honestly. Don't shy away from treating their fears honestly, but you must teach them how to overcome their fears. Otherwise, they learn to become governed by fear. If children never mature in how to handle fear, then that fear controls them. Fear governs them. And let me tell you something about fear. Fear is an emotion that tilts the balance, if there's any balance to be had, of moral restraint. When we have borders around us, and we know what those borders are, and we know what moral restraint is supposed to look like, that is, we know what is right and we know what is wrong. When we're afraid, we lose perspective on that balance. When we're afraid, the emotions take over and the seesaw, the balance is tipped. And it's tipped toward moral failure. So if we don't learn how to deal with fear when one is afraid, moral failure is almost a certain fruit of fear. Let me give you a second emotion. The emotion of selfishness. Yes, I'm calling selfishness an emotion. Kids must learn the art of how to extend beyond their own universe. They are not the still small point in this ever-turning universe. They are a part of a bigger picture. And they must learn how to extend from their rooted and inbred and inborn selfishness, their own foolishness, to see themselves in the bigger picture. You know, babies who are dependent. And when have you ever seen a baby that isn't? Babies are dependent. They cry. They tease. They test the boundaries. They want to be fed. They want to be changed. When their needs are present, they want those needs addressed immediately. Patience is not a virtue in little babies, is it? Amen? Now here's the problem. Babies who are dependent, and they all are, but remain such, become adult babies who believe they are the center of the universe. Babies who never master selfishness become adult babies who are selfish. The whole universe revolves around meeting their needs, and it becomes clear what would happen. If, as the scripture tells us, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, and that the discipline of a godly father, a godly mother will drive it out of them, and if that's never applied, if that foolishness remains, if that discipline is not present, if that foolishness is bound up in the heart of that child, I guarantee you this, when that child grows up, he or she will believe and insist that the world owes them a living because the foolishness has never been dealt with. Now you can imagine what a selfish man and a selfish woman look like when it comes to this whole issue of moral restraint. There isn't any. Because you see, what's important is what I believe I need and what I believe I want. So often we're bent on meeting every one of our child's needs. Wrongly, I might add. As parents, you want to ensure that your child is guarded against experiencing any pain. That's the worst kind of parenting you can have. Somehow thinking that your child is not entitled to pain. Now, I'm not saying go look for it, and I'm not saying inflict it on your child. But I am saying that there are lessons that we learn about how to drive selfishness out of us that we can learn no other way but through trial, through painful and difficult trial. In the process of raising our children, we raise them with a leash, a short leash. And we allowed that leash to go out as they were learning and maturing and proving that they can handle more of the leash. We'll talk about that later. Dan would practice his rock music. He got his guitar, learned to play the guitar, got down into the basement with his brother and his next door neighbor, and they had their own little rock band. And you could see our house going pa-poom, 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 pa-poom. And there was a time along the way where I would allow him to go into that kind of direction, realizing that foolishness was bound up in the heart of my child. And at the same time, allowing him to spread his wings so that he can really test his gifts. Allowing him to go a little bit in this direction, knowing full well that I know what the borders are, and I'm going to guard those borders. And there were times where I would turn the light off in the basement as they were hitting their high pitches. Just turn the light off, it would go dark, the music would stop. I would turn the light back on, say, Mark, Dan, done. And they never answered me back because they knew when I said done, it was done. I tell you that story to tell you this one. When they had one of their so-called concerts, they had it at a local PCA church. And all the youth were there. You know, they all wanted to be rock stars. Everybody wanted to be a rock star. Dad and mom didn't know all that much, but they wanted to be rock stars. And we knew they weren't going to be rock stars because we weren't going to let them be rock stars. But we wanted them to test their wings, to test their mettle, so to speak. And we were at this concert, and guess who was running the sound at this concert? Me. And I got to tell you, I'll make the story short. They were miserable failures at that concert. They were awful. And they knew it. Young Chuck came up to me at one point, and while they're playing up there acting crazy, he came up to me and he said, Dad, turn them off. And I said to him, no. They need to be delivered over to this failure. They need to feel this pain and feel it good. Now, I say that, just tell you that story. It's a small thing, but you know, when you start talking about your children mastering selfishness, there are times when you must deliver them over so that they can experience exactly what you're trying to say to them with your words, because they don't think you're right. But if you're a wise mom or you're a wise dad, there are times when you let that leash go, knowing full well that there's a bulldog at the end that is going to bite them, and knowing full well that it's going to hurt. When those boys got into the car after that concert, they did not say one word. About halfway home, I heard one of them in the back say this, "We were awful, weren't we?" I didn't have to tell them. Yes, you were. You were very awful, because they already knew that. You see, we're so often bent on meeting every one of their needs, precluding any pain in their lives, but that's not what life is. We're not supposed to live that way. We live in a fallen and a broken world. And part of life in that fallen and broken world is broken bones, broken hearts, broken emotions, broken relationships, and broken spirits. Our kids need to learn that they live in a context that starts with their family and their siblings and their parents. You'll see it first tested in sibling rivalry, won't you? Selfishness that occurs between brothers and sisters. The sibling rivalry when one is blessed and the other one isn't. When one receives something, the other one doesn't. You start perhaps by teaching them that property rights are a sacred trust. We taught our kids that what is in their rooms belongs to them, and that it is a sacred trust. It is something that only one or two people can take from them, and that's mom or dad. Their brothers or their sisters needed to honor and respect the border that starts at the door. Now, let me tell you something about your pianist, executive director, minister of music. The biggest tease in the world is my son Chuck. And he knew the property rights stopped at the door. You would often see him go up to the door, and Mark or Dan would be in the room knowing Chuck's coming. Chuck's around the corner. Here comes Chuck. Dad told you not to come past this door. This is my door. This is my property. Don't come in. Now, you know how tall Chuck is. Imagine how he can hang on to a door and lean in. Imagine how he can intimidate as he's leaning on the door, almost all the way in the room, but never really stepping foot over the line. And then we would hear the yelling and the screaming going on upstairs, the siblings fighting among themselves. And you know, if you never deal with that, what starts out as cute becomes invasive. And the sacred gift, the rights of ownership that we raise our children to believe in, can easily be violated by selfishness. That's why in Proverbs 3, verse 27, it says this: "Do not withhold good from those who deserve it." Now, implied in that is good can be withheld from those who don't deserve it. When it is in your power to act, don't hold it back. Do not say to your neighbor, "Come back later, I'll give it to you tomorrow," when you have it now to give to him. Do not plot harm against your neighbor who lives trustfully near you. Do not accuse a man for no reason when he has done you no harm. You know what the writer here is telling these kids? You live in context. You live beside people. You live beside family members and neighbors and that circle of influence, and God has designed you to be an agent of redemption. If it's in your power to minister to those around you, you must learn to step outside of yourself and touch those who have great need. Imagine a child who never learns that, who grows up believing that life owes them a living, that this context of human relationships doesn't apply to them. He tells him three things in that passage. When you're blessed, that blessing is an empowerment to bless. When God blesses you, he blesses you for a reason, and that reason he blesses you is for you to bless. Blessings are never to be received and taken in just for your benefit. That's why the gifts of the Spirit that God gives to the church are never for the purpose of edifying yourself. God doesn't give spiritual gifts to edify you. He gives you spiritual gifts to edify others, to build up the body of Christ. And that's a selfless life instead of a selfish life. So he tells them the first thing: when you're blessed, you're empowered to bless. When you can alleviate another person's pain, do it now. When it's in your power to take pain away from someone, do it now. Thirdly, it is a fundamental violation of trust to plot another's harm in order to gain something personally. He lays those principles out. Now, a few verses later, he's going to start talking about moral failure. The reason he's building his case at this point is because of selfishness. Because a man treats a woman in the same way, in many cases, a man will treat a woman in the way he treats his sister or he treats his mother. And he learns from observing how his dad treats his wife. He watches as dad and mom interact, and he's learning as she is learning how to treat a man, how to treat a woman, what to expect. When I used to do premarital counseling years ago, I would send couples to their prospective in-laws for an interview. They had to go for an interview. So the girl who's going to marry this guy would sit down with this guy's parents, with the guy sitting there taking notes, but he was not allowed to speak. So you got your future mother-in-law, your future father-in-law, and you're going to ask them some very pointed questions. How do you two handle conflict? When your husband is wrong, how does he act when he's wrong? How does he respond when he knows he's wrong? How do you, and we would ask them a variety of questions about how they interrelate with one another. That girl's sitting there and she's learning her husband. Because her husband grew up in that context and he learned from watching dad how to treat a woman. And he learned how to watch, by watching his mother, how a woman responds. And then the story is turned a little bit. She then begins to ask her future in-laws this question: how is your son like the two of you? What can I expect? How does he handle conflict? Is he more like you, future father-in-law? Or is he more like you, future mother-in-law? What can I expect? And they take notes, and they bring those notes back to me, and we begin to map a strategy for how we're going to deal with the conflicts that seem to be inevitable between the two of them. And then the role is reversed. The man goes and he visits with his future in-laws, and he asks them the same question about his future wife. Why do I do this? Why is all that work necessary? And by the way, it's extremely intimidating to the future in-laws because they're learning something about themselves, about what they raised and what they're presenting to their future daughter-in-law or future son-in-law. I say this very simply for this reason. If they're selfish, he's probably selfish. If they're self-centered, he's probably self-centered. Or at least the seeds are present, something that she ought to open her eyes about, something she ought to take a long, hard look at. Have I seen these evidences of self-centeredness? Has my future husband ever learned to be a giver? Or does everything in his life revolve around him? You see, what will happen here, friends, is that as he picks up these negative, self-centered habits from parents, moral compromise between a man and a woman is really an act of selfishness and disrespect, isn't it? That's what moral compromise is. When a man morally offends a woman, he has selfishly acted in his own interest rather than in her interest. That's why I'll say to him, when he fully understands and fully confesses what he's done, and he's confessed it to God, I'll say, you got one other person you need to confess this to. You need to go back to her. And you need to tell her how you have morally wronged her. That if you really loved her, you would have never allowed her to commit such a grave sin against her God. That a man who truly loves a woman will not allow her to morally fail when it's in his power to do so. He must confess his self-centeredness. Whenever we have marriage counseling, one of the first questions over the years that I have asked couples when they come in is did you have premarital relationships? Now you ask that in this culture, it's going to be, yeah, so. You know what happens premaritally when you have moral failure? You have sown a seed of distrust in the relationship. It's just a seed. Satan's too smart to plant a tree. He just plants a seed, and then he walks away. 5, 10 years down the road, he's been coming all along watering that seed. All along, he's been fertilizing it until all of a sudden it grows up into a tree of distrust. And it started way back when. The basic foundational element of trust rooted in selfishness was violated. And you must extract that tree, because you see what you did premaritally is you cheated on each other. You violated each other. You morally offended each other. And he who cheats with you will eventually cheat on you. And the seeds of distrust are rooted in a spirit of selfishness. So you have fear, you have selfishness. Let me give you a third emotion, the emotion of pride. Look at Proverbs 3, verse 31. Do not envy a violent man or choose any of his ways. For the Lord detests a perverse man, but takes the upright into his confidence. Watch this language now. Catch this language. Did you notice the word he used in verse 32? The Lord detests. He doesn't use that word that often. King James calls it abomination. There are few things that are an abomination to God. There are few things that he considers, to use this word, the Lord detests a perverse man, but takes the upright into his confidence. Always note the contrast when you're studying the Proverbs. Here is the contrast between a perverse man and an upright man. The perverse man, God says, I detest him. The upright man, God says, you're in my inner sanctum of confidence. I'm taking you into my inner sanctum. You and I are going to have a special, endearing relationship. Look at verse 33. Strong language. The Lord's curse. Now this is this dad teaching this little boy. The Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the righteous. Notice that the curse is on the house of the wicked. He calls the wicked's dwelling place a house. But what does he call the righteous dwelling place? A home. A home. There's a difference between the house that you have and the home that you've created. Verse 34, he mocks. He just said he detested. He also said he curses. Now he said he mocks. God mocks proud mockers, but gives grace to the humble. The wise inherit honor, but fools he holds up to shame. This is language, friends, you can't miss. He warns his son, do not envy someone who lusts for power. What is there to envy in someone who is ruled by a passion that takes pleasure in the pain of another? What's there to envy in that? This is the stuff, he tells his son, bullies are made out of. This is how you raise a bully. Can one be happy when the frown of heaven is on him? Can you really be happy when God's brow is furrowed? When he detests and curses and mocks what your kids have become? When God uses such harsh language to describe their fate? Bullies are an abomination to God, but those who are friends to the oppressed, those who are friends to those in need, those who have stepped out of their own selfishness and in humility, not pride, in humility, have humbled themselves to reach out and to befriend the oppressed, they're granted the inner sanctum of God's confidence. Let me see if I can give you a brief illustration of that. Jesus had how many apostles? How many? 12. It's not a trick question. Come on, wake up. How many disciples, apostles did Jesus have? 12. How many formed the inner sanctum? 3. Now let me tell you something about those 3. Out of the 12, they were the most proud and arrogant. James and Peter and John formed the inner sanctum. And rather than looking at these men and saying they were the inner sanctum because they were the holiest of the 12, look at it a different way. They were the inner sanctum because they had more to learn. They had more that God had to teach them. There was some humbling that needed to go on. These were proud men. James and John had a mom who wanted their sons to be on the right hand and the left hand when Jesus came into his kingdom. Make this one your right hand, make this one your left hand. They were called the son of Boanerges, the sons of thunder. Their dad was a hothead. This is what they were raised with. They had much to learn, didn't they? But as God was humbling them, and boy did he humble them. Boy did he humble them. You look at, I wish we had the time to explore the inner sanctum moments with these men. The places where he took them that he didn't take anybody else were all humbling experiences. He had much to teach them because they were groomed for leadership. Peter and James and John would become the great triumvirate of men around which the church would gain its confidence and its leadership. But he had to break them first. What this dad is teaching his son is when you reach out to the oppressed, when you are humbled, when God brings you down low, he's bringing you down low for a reason. And if you see that lesson, if you gain that understanding, I will bring you into the inner sanctum and teach you secrets no one else is going to learn. He warns his son that a home filled with bullies is a cursed home. And a home filled with fair and just people is a blessed home. He scorns the scorner, and he gives grace to the humble. Peter and James would both quote these verses. Peter and James would pick up these very verses. James would say in James 4:6, he gives more grace. That is why the scripture says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He's quoting that verse. Peter would say in 1 Peter 5:5, young men in the same way be submissive to those who are older. All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. You think Peter and James learned it? I think so. They learned the meaning of submission. If you do not break a child's will, by the time his or her personality is formed, it is going to be an uphill struggle from that point on. And there's a vast difference between breaking a child's will and breaking a child's spirit. You don't want to break their spirit, but you do want to break their will. And you know how you break their will? By showing them borders. Kids crave borders. When you see an unhappy and miserable child, it is because mommy and daddy are afraid of him or afraid of her, when all along this little boy is screaming out, I need borders. And that's where happy children go up. A child who is never broken is usually placated by weary parents who somehow conclude it's better to give him what he wants than to do the work that's necessary to teach him, to break his will, or to humble him. That is why so much of the gospel record gives very practical examples of men and women who got it. Men and women who understood, all of whom were in different stations of life, like the centurion. The centurion in Matthew chapter 8, verse 5 says, when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed in this terrible suffering. Jesus said to him, I'll go and heal him. Now, Jesus knew what he was going to say next. The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. And then notice what that centurion says next. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. I tell this one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was astonished. Jesus was astonished and said to those following him, I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. You know what the man's saying? To have authority over others you must first be under authority yourself. To learn godly leadership, you must be submitted. The man knew, as a centurion, what authority he held. Go here, go there, go this way, go that way, do this, do that. And they listened. By saying that, he's saying to Jesus, I am submitted to your authority. I will do whatever you tell me to do. I know you have the authority to just say the word, and my servant will be healed. That's a man who knows how to submit to authority. That's humility. That's the opposite of pride. Are you raising a man or a woman under authority?
You've been listening to Dr. Chuck F. Betters in this program brought to you by MarkInc.org, proclaiming the truth that God is sovereign and you can trust him. Please visit us online at MarkInc.org to learn about other free resources, such as our Help and Hope personal stories addressing a variety of topics and difficult circumstances. Hear answers to tough questions about suffering and the sovereignty of God in our Ask Dr. Betters video series. Receive encouraging devotionals from Daily Treasure and more. Looking for help? We now offer online biblical counseling service through Anchored Hope Biblical Counseling, an online platform that will bring solid biblical counseling to those in need wherever and whenever they need it. Visit biblicalcounseling.online to make an appointment today.